It is with great pleasure we have Rhue come to talk to us today. Lauren does a whole variety of interesting things that most of you find interesting. Everything from crowds. She has an old Wikipedia paper from way back, and she does a lot on bias and machine learning and fairness. And I think that's mostly what we're going to hear about today, which is great. And take it away, Lauren.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to present this joint work with Jessica Clark. I'm going to be talking about automatically signaling quality, a study of the fairness economics trade-off in reducing bias through AI, ML on digital platforms. So it's a bit of a big title, but there's a lot that's in there. So digital platforms, I don't have to tell this particular audience, but they're a transformative force in the economy. We have 50% of people using social media. We have the sharing economy, which is growing. I mean, even now in the pandemic, right, you're still seeing Airbnb take off. As we were just talking about, people want to work from anywhere and feel more comfortable with this peer-to-peer versus a large corporation like a hotel. 10 technology trends to watch during COVID, online shopping. So again, you're seeing the importance of technology and these mediated interactions. And then of course, crowdfunding. So our context is going to be on crowdfunding, and we're seeing crowdfunding surge in the pandemic, both for new businesses as well as for people who are looking for, who need money and who are looking for innovative ways of getting it. So some basics of crowdfunding, of course. Crowdfunding is a platform in which you put a project up and you solicit these small donations. So maybe it's $10, $50, $100, and then in aggregate, you can achieve what your goal is. Crowdfunding has received a lot of popular press over the last 5 years. So we have the basics of crowdfunding, keeping up with Kickstarter from 2015. Some of these big crowdfunding campaigns can become so popular that they get covered in the Wall Street Journal, and they really make the national news. And Kickstarter itself has been an important player in this industry. So some examples of crowdfunding: Indiegogo is one very popular crowdfunding venture. Donors Choose and Kiva are pro-social. So you can have crowdfunding for different purposes. Donors Choose to support classrooms. Kiva is microloans to less fortunate folks. GoFundMe is just a general crowdfunding platform, but we're going to focus on Kickstarter. So Kickstarter is project-based. You have some type of an endeavor, a film, a technology, a business that you're trying to get off the ground, and so you're going to create a project to solicit donations. This is an example of a Kickstarter project. This is a slightly older screenshot, but it more coordinates with the data that we're looking at. Each Kickstarter project has a project photo. It's going to have success measures on the side. So we have the number of backers, the number of pledges, and then some time frame for it. There's the location, the category, and then the description, which goes below the fold here, and then information about the fundraiser photo. So there's extensive information about the project itself that's presented on these crowdfunding platforms. We know there are several factors that influence success in crowdfunding. So category, timing, location, certain types of projects like technology projects are more likely to achieve success. If you can get early donations, that's going to create more of a push towards success, and then the location of where the project is. Also, we know that information in the project description itself is going to influence crowdfunding success. So there are certain words and phrases that are going to be evocative and then lead to more crowdfunding success. And then the project photos themselves. So the emotions in the project photos can also encourage success. There seems to be smiling faces lead to higher success in crowdfunding. And then what this paper focuses on is the Projects We Love badge. So Kickstarter staff goes through and identifies particular projects that they think are really interesting or innovative, and they give it what they call a Project We Love badge. So here's what that would look like. Here's another Kickstarter project. And you can see at the very bottom, there's just that Projects We Love designation. So it's very simple as far as the difference between the difference on the page itself. But projects we love have a special page dedicated to it. So when you go on Kickstarter, you can go click a link from the home page and see all of the projects that are considered projects we love. This designation can lead to a huge difference for the crowdfunding, for the project itself. Projects with that Project We Love designation have an over 200% increase in success rate. They go from about a 35% success rate overall to about a 79% success rate. So really, it makes a big, big difference. So then the next question is, how do they decide which projects become projects we love? Kickstarter is now giving guidance on that. And so of course, there's a limit to exactly what they'll tell you about it, but they say that the project image matters, so it should be crisp, no logos or badges, that it should be captivating, it should be a detailed description. So we already see that the image matters, the text matters, and then creativity and what they think people will be interested in. So there's still this level of subjectivity involved in how they decide what becomes a project we love. Right?
Lauren?
Yes.
Hi, question. Is this determination done manually or algorithmically?
So right now, in this data set, it's done manually.
So there's an employee that looks at all the projects and says, this is a project we love, this is not.
Yes. Staff members come and they choose it. Yep.
Okay, thanks.
Yep. All right, so are there any other questions? Okay, great. And if you have any questions, feel free, of course, to just stop and let me know.
I'm assuming that the employees cannot have any relation to the project, right? Because then there is I expect that it's going to increase like you said, it increases the probability of success. So it cannot be a project related to an employee.
To my understanding, yes. There's no conflict of interest as far as employees giving to their to either projects they're involved with or project that their family or friends are involved with.
And you don't know whether there's any process, like at least 2 employees need to pick it independently, or there is a voting, and how many projects can get this badge in a given time?
So there's no limit on the number of projects that can get the badge. We've found that about 10% of projects receive this Projects We Love designation.
Thanks.
Okay.
Can I ask a quick question? Do these projects get ranked higher when you're searching through the list? Is there some sort of, if you go and you look at open projects, do they get upweighted?
So to my knowledge, they don't get upweighted, but they do show up at the top of the list. So there's a Projects We Love and then all the other projects below it, but it's not that they show up in a mixed sense. Does that make sense?
Right, so they get put to the very, very top. So it's almost the same as saying, actually, if you're looking at the ranking algorithms, as if you just put these ones, right at the top.
Yeah, they have much higher visibility. Yeah. Yep.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, any other questions? All right. So now I'm going to shift gears a bit to talking about bias in digital platforms. Bias in digital platforms became a national conversation in 2016 with the hashtag Airbnb while Black. You may have read this article. This is the creator of the hashtag Airbnb while Black, Cortana, and she explained that she was struggling to book an Airbnb when she used her profile photo on the left and her full first name. When she changed her profile photo to the cityscape on the right and shortened her name to Tina, she didn't experience the same type of challenges making Airbnb bookings. This anecdotal evidence is supported by academic research. We find previous research has found that guests experience discrimination based on names in Airbnb and other platforms. That's Edelman and Luca, Fishman and Luca, Edelman et al., 2017. Also, previous research has found in ride-sharing platforms that African Americans and traditionally underrepresented groups experience more cancellations, that African American male fundraisers face lower success rates in crowdfunding platforms, and then another paper that I'm working on with Jessica, we also find that African American fundraisers experience 50% lower success rate. So the we're noticing this is a very consistent challenge in these disparities for success in digital platforms. There have been several recommendations out there to reduce bias, and this is in no way an exhaustive list. One is to minimize or anonymize the markers of identity. So that's minimizing the names or minimizing the photos. Dynamic pricing to disincentivize bias. That was another recommendation to reduce disparities. And then the last one is the stronger quality or reputation signal for these users. And so that's what we're really going to focus on in this paper is how can we think about how we transmit these signals of quality in order to reduce disparities on the website or on the platform. There are a couple of papers that have suggested this. One is reviews in Airbnb. So this Airbnb, this paper looked at an experiment with Airbnb listings and found that the differences in likelihood to rent to a host completely disappear when you have a review for that host. And the same thing with the PWL badges, that if you're looking at a crowdfunding platform and you have a African American and a white fundraiser, if they both have the Projects We Love designation, the disparities completely disappear. So if that's the case, then let's think about how we distribute these PWL badges. They're not evenly distributed currently. Overall, it's about 10% of projects in general, but it's about 5% for African American fundraisers. So they're half as likely to receive this PWL badge. So the question is, how can we increase that, right? Is there a way to more equitably distribute the badges?
Sorry.
I'll stop right there. Questions?
Yes. Is this gap, so that African Americans are half as likely to receive PWL, even conditioning on all the observables you can observe?
Yes.
Or is this just raw averages?
So if you look at it on average, that's what you see, but we have we've conditioned on all our observables. So people ask things like, well, is it about quality? We find that the descriptions are the same as far as the reading level, the sophistication, use of slang. So we see no major difference as far as the quality themselves of the projects, but we still find that if there is a fundraiser whose picture is African American, that they are half as likely to receive a PWL badge and also less likely to be successful.
Okay, great, thank you.
And that's been shown in experimental settings as well. Any other questions on this? Because this is our big question: is how can we equitably distribute the PWL badges? Okay.
Well, yeah. So I have a question, question or a comment. So it's not clear to me what is the goal of giving the badge, because if the goal of giving the badge is to increase the success, and for other reasons there is discrimination against minorities, then giving the badge to minorities may not sufficiently increase the chances of success, and then giving the badge to the same people who would succeed anyway is exactly what the website may want to do. So is this, is it really a goal to provide more fairness with giving the We Love It badge? Or what is so what I'm struggling with is what is the goal of the website to give the badge in the first place?
The goal to give the badge is to highlight interesting products. So it's trying to boost projects that seem interesting and they want them to be successful.
Okay. I mean, I would expect that they want to increase the success of projects, and it may be the best bet is to increase. So basically, what the website is struggling is that there may not be enough liquidity with having enough support for a particular project. So if the project is not getting enough of the support, then it's not going to get funded. So it's not going to go forward. So the website probably wants to have more very successful projects. So either with the badge, it may want to take over the thresholds, the projects that are at the risk of not getting funded. And then it may be worthwhile to actually target the ones that are not favored enough by the market by itself. Or maybe the website wants to increase the amount raised for the most successful projects. And then it is going to promote the projects that it thinks that it thinks they are going to be successful anyway. And then it's going to exacerbate the discrimination. Right. So it's like from the point of view of the metrics of the website, what is the purpose? What is the objective to give the badge? Because just saying interesting projects is very subjective.
So that's exactly the challenge. It's not as strategic as either of the two strategies that you mentioned. So it's not about pushing projects over the finish line because it's dedicated at the very beginning. And then it's also not about trying to move projects into the successful category. It is truly just they want to have some way of sifting through and highlighting interesting projects. And I'll show you a couple of examples of projects we love that are identified by Kickstarter as a project we love, but that may not fall into projects that certainly weren't identified by our algorithm, but also in looking at it, I was surprised it was designated a project we love. So I can get back to that a little bit more when I have a couple of examples. Okay. Any other questions?
Yeah, I think another way of asking Anna's question is, is our fairness and revenue maximization complements or substitutes? Like, is there a trade-off between these two, or by increasing fairness, you also increase revenues?
Okay, so that is literally in 3 slides. I'm going to talk about that as the setup for this paper. So,
and thank you, Chiara, for rephrasing. Yes, this is what I was getting at.
Okay,
no problem.
Great. So we talked about equitably distributing the badges, and we're suggesting automation so that if we use some type of a predictive model, we can have more consistency, and that can reduce disparities. And partially because we do know that there's increased disparities in times where there's subjective criteria. So automating transactions and ride sharing and in Airbnb are methods to decrease disparities, and same thing with automated resume screening. As long as there's sufficient variety in your data set, you can pick out pockets of opportunity that may be missed if it's a person looking at it, but because AI is going to find these complex patterns, you're able to identify maybe less traditional people who are likely to be successful but have less traditional backgrounds. So this is our first research question: is does using predictive AI models to recommend PWL increase equity? And the idea behind it is that you would find these pockets of interesting projects that maybe don't fall into the traditional model. But then you take it a step further because AI can also perpetuate bias, and it can perpetuate bias because it adopts these contextual and societal biases that are out there. And so if there's a chance that big data is going to actually perpetuate it, maybe we should use fairness-aware machine learning. So fairness-aware machine learning uses these quantitative fairness measures and can include it both in training the model and in post-processing. So after we have a model and a set of scores, maybe we need to change the processing afterwards in order to increase fairness. Whenever we talk about fairness, it's going to be based off of a subgroup fairness. So some fairness or disparity around sensitive attributes. In this case, the sensitive attribute is going to be race. We are going to specifically look at demographic parity, and demographic parity is one of the simplest measures of fairness. It's just the difference in the estimated values between the demographic groups. So if we look at the estimates for the sensitive attribute being 1, and we look at the estimates for the sensitive attribute being 0, what is that difference and how can we minimize that? Okay. So our second research question is, does using fairness-aware models to recommend these PWL badges further increase equity? So does automation increase it? Does fairness-aware models increase it even more? And then our last kind of section is the fairness versus business outcomes. So there's two different perspectives on this. The first is that there's going to be a trade-off between fairness and other measures, right? There's going to be this fairness accuracy trade-off. And so maybe from a platform perspective, fairness is not what they're going to look for because it might harm their other business objectives. And the second perspective is that diversity can actually improve decisions such as investment choices. We're able to find these high quality products or find these opportunities that may not be available if everybody comes at it with the same perspective. So we're going to look at this and try to understand, does this more equitable distribution of PWL badges affect the business outcomes for the platform? So do we see expected changes in success or expected changes in the number of backers?
So Lauren, question. So on that last one, on this last point, maybe you'll get to this. I could imagine two different ways of phrasing decision making here. One is you use the algorithm to screen for candidates for a PWL, and then you have a human to choose who gets the badge. Or you can do it in the other in the exact opposite order. You can have the humans make their choices and then have the algorithm identify additional candidates that had not made it and make the humans second guess themselves. And those will actually, I suspect, lead to very different kinds of final decisions. And how are you thinking about it? Or maybe you're going to, you see where I'm coming?
I do, and you've taken me right to some of my future research and opportunities, because right now what I'm looking at is just the strictly human process versus the strictly automated process. But some other research I'm doing is looking at what happens when you combine them. So perhaps instead of just having the strictly automated process, we also have, this is the input to a recommendation system, let's say. So we have the top ones are then screened by people. Yeah.
Got it.
So I think there's a lot of opportunity in this area. Absolutely.
Okay.
Okay. So the research questions, just to summarize, are: does using predictive AI machine learning models increase the parity? Does using fairness-aware models further increase equity? And then does more equitable distribution change the business outcomes for the platform? So those are broad research questions. The key findings, which I'll go into how we got them, but we find essentially yes, yes, and mixed. So predictive models do yield more equitable distribution across the different, across a sensitive attribute, and fairness-aware models yield even more of a equitable distribution. So we find some improvement with just using automation. We find even more improvement using fairness-aware automation, but we find this mixed result as far as the business objectives. We see this increase in success rate and a decrease in backers. So that's something we're looking into more, because it's a fascinating result to try to understand what levers are we pushing. But it is still possible. The differences, while significant, are statistically significant, are not as strong as some might expect.
Lauren, sorry. A quick question. Isn't point 2 sort of mechanically true? Meaning if you input a constraint, and I'm not familiar with the ML models that you're using, but if you add a constraint that the difference in success rate, in sort of certification of African American versus not African American is a constraint, an explicit constraint in your ML model, wouldn't you automatically obtain these results?
So yes, it was not in any way surprising. It was really the first one that's surprising, but we needed to use that as our building block for the third point to understand the fairness-aware versus the fairness-aware designation and the success measures.
I guess the more interesting question is by how much more 2 increases equity compared to 1? Because of course it will increase it, but by how much more, that's the important question.
That's a fair point. So I will incorporate that when I talk about the findings later. And we are going to get into what the difference is. We still never get to full parity, but we do increase from about 6% to almost 8% or almost 9%. So that's about a 50% increase roughly in the differences of disparity, but it's only a handful of projects. But let me talk more about the process and the results.
Yeah. So I mean, just to go back. So to rephrase Kara's point, it's if you put a constraint to increase fairness, then it's no wonder that you are increasing fairness between 1 and 2, right? It's a good thing that you get this result. Otherwise, you would be really worried, right? But for number 3, so this kind of goes back. So if the backers are discriminating, right? What I worry about, like, I would like to see more fairness in investment, but if the backers are discriminating, what I worry is that having more fairness in recommendation actually may be decreasing the actual investment, and the trust in recommendation may backfire. Do you see any of that in number 3?
So we don't have the reputational risk, but I think that because what we're looking at is more of the consistency. So that, I think that's more of the mechanism that we're finding, that there's more of a consistency across all of them. I don't think you'd have the same reputational risk as, let's say, if you had different thresholds, right? So that would be, I think, a much higher risk as far as the backers. One thing that we're finding about as far as the success model is our models have a preference for lower goal projects, which is another reason why we might see lower backers. And so we're trying to dig into that now. But if you have a lower goal project, then you're not going to need as many backers to get across the finish line, and you're more likely to be successful. So that's another element as well, as far as how our model works compared with the real world and what we might see. Okay. So our data, we're using all Kickstarter projects as of December 2014. We have only project goals of greater than 100 and less than 250,000, US only, and that gives us about 100,000 projects. Again, we've seen this before when we look at the Kickstarter projects. So we have all of these different dimensions. We have the key attributes of the project photo. We have the fundraiser photo, project information about success. So the number of backers, the amount of money that's pledged, and then what the deadline is. We also have the location, timing, and then of course, if it's a product we love, and the description goes below the fold. We classified the pictures that are both in the fundraiser picture and the campaign picture. We classified it using facial recognition for race, for the number of faces, for smiling. And then we also did look at a sample of those to run a quality control on it to make sure that it's accurate. And so we have a variety of information about all of the projects, and they fall into 6 large categories. And I want to go through what they are just so you can see how we're classifying these projects. We have our project background, image, description, success measures, our sensitive attribute, and then, of course, the project we love badge. For the background, we have project categories. We have the timeline. So what's the launch date and the deadline? We have the location, so US, state, and region, as well as location type. So is it a town? Is it country? What's the fundraising goal and what's the amount of money raised? And then for success measures, we use 2. We have our binary success. So does the money raised exceed the goal? And then the number of backers. For our project description, we construct the text attributes using the number of words, sentence characteristics, so the syllabus, a sentence counter, and also parts of speech. So we're using a parser, and we include all of these, the adjectives, the nouns, etc., just the number of those in our description as well. Furthermore, we try to understand some attributes of it. So we have our sentiment analysis using the AFIN dictionary and subject clues dictionary. We identify words that are predictive of success on Kickstarter, and we also have our reading score and our reading level. In addition, so that's our project description measures. In addition, we analyze each image to look at what's in the image using Microsoft Cognitive Services. So we have the tags, we have the captions and the colors. So we have the foreground color and the background color. Then we run a topic model for the image captions so we can have a better understanding of the content of it. So we have our topics. We use 20 topics, and we use the entire distribution of topics over each document. In this case, that's a picture. And here's some of the examples. We have people posing for a photo. We have cartoon characters. We have background patterns. We have logos. people playing guitar, and letters. So you can see we have a variety of different types of pictures that are in here. And interestingly enough, we do find that some of these are relevant as far as the PWL and as far as success.
Yeah, Lauren, just a quick. So, I mean, I knew there were people who had worked on dictionaries to predict success in projects. In the things you're going through now, like which are using ML to classify pictures and so on, has anybody ever done the prediction of success on the basis of this kind of analysis that you're doing now?
I haven't seen anybody predicting success based off of this, no, but people have predicted success off of a variety of different things, not necessarily the picture, but other descriptions.
Other attributes. Well. Yeah. But so you're novel, at least in this respect, right? That's all I was getting at. I don't think I'd seen anybody do this before, which is.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. It's hard, but it's.
So. All right, next we construct the sensitive attribute. And so we're using face++, and it's essentially giving us the number of faces, the race, and the gender, and the confidence for all of them. And again, we verified a sample using Amazon Mechanical Turk, and we verified it ourselves. So we felt it was about 95% confidence across all of the pictures. And the sensitive attribute is 1 if the fundraiser is African American and 0 otherwise. How we created this is if there are multiple faces, we have the number of faces. Each face is given an attribute for the degree to which it's smiling and a gender and a race. We then use binary variables. So if we have the number of faces is 3, we take the average number of people smiling. We have binary variables for if somebody is male, if somebody is female, if somebody is white, if somebody is Black. And here's a longer list of all of the variables that we used. So I'm not going to get into this, but it's more here for posterity. And we've covered many of them already. Also, the number of pledge amounts, I should say that as well. So there's different levels of contribution, and that ends up being a contributing factor in our model, and that's consistent with previous research.
If I can, Lauren, it looks like, is it Xinyan? I think who has problems with their audio, so she's sent a chat. If I could just read it.
Oh, yes.
Yeah. So she says, Lauren, is there any score that can capture the quality, in quotes, of a project? And she's wondering, what is the quality like for a PWL project between a Black and a white fundraiser? Is it that Black fundraisers led projects that need to have a higher bar to receive the PWL badge?
So that's a great question. One of the big challenges is that there isn't a measure of quality for each project, partially because it's a creative endeavor. So how do you define quality of a film versus a food versus startup versus technology? As far as the attributes we can measure, so things like the reading level, the reading ease, there aren't many differences between African-American projects and other projects. The one difference we do note that's significant is the length of the project description, but aside from that, there aren't differences. One other aspect too is the topics, and that's something else that we don't get into very much in this paper, but there's cultural differences as far as what African-American fundraisers, white fundraisers, Asian fundraisers, and fundraisers with no face talk about, right? So very often it'll be something that could be related to, let's say, Japan if it's an Asian fundraiser, or related to gospel if it's a Black fundraiser. And that gets into a whole other question about, is it about the topics themselves, and if some topics are viewed as more interesting than others. Yeah. So I hope that answers your question. We have spent a lot of time thinking about how we can measure quality, because that's one of the first questions that people ask is about the quality, and it's very difficult to compare the projects.
Yeah. So can I? one response to that, it would seem like, I mean, maybe you're going to get into this in a moment. It would seem like there are going to be a subset of projects where they're going to be very close in attribute space, except for something like race, gender, or the funder, the person or the fundraiser. But otherwise, they'll be the same in all the other attributes. And then there will be, that's where the two Venn diagrams overlap, if you will. And then there will be those that will tend to be on topics where there is no overlap, coming from somebody who's, say, not African American, and they're maybe male African, male white, if you will, the most extreme, right? Female African American, and different set of topics. And so it would seem to me, from from the statistics you're about to do, that's an interesting division, in the sense that where there's direct overlap, you get one kind of you get one kind of comparison, and then you'd like to actually know if the statistical outcomes you see there look any different from those outside of that overlapping, where they're near identical. Do you see what I'm asking?
I think I do. We didn't cover it in this paper, but we have done a match sample where we look at everything and try to get them as similar as possible, with the exception of the race or the gender, and see what we find. And we do find differences even still, and we even then, and we also look at the topics themselves. So we look at, okay, what are people talking about? And yeah, we still find these differences.
Interesting. Okay, thanks.
Yep. So this is a summary in our data set. This is looking at across the entire data set. Overall, 11% of projects have this PWL, whereas it's 5% for A = 1. And it's really a stark difference. So just to highlight the difference that receiving this Projects We Love designation will make, it will change the success rate from 35% overall to 79% overall. And for African-American fundraisers, it's 18% to 68%. And the amount of money raised is even a stronger jump. So we see that this designation really does make a difference for the fundraiser themselves if they can get this designation. Okay. So any questions about the data set as we jump into the methodology? Okay. So the methodology overview, there's 7 broad steps. First, to train models to assign this PWL. Then we go from the PWL badges, and our models are going to produce a propensity score, right? They're going to produce a probability. So we need to somehow translate that probability into a discrete binary recommendation. And then we estimate the effect of the PWL recommendations on project success. Okay.
Lauren, quick question.
Yes.
Can you go back to the previous slide for 1 second? In
Sure.
your first model, what's the outcome when you're training this model?
On PWL.
So you're using the historical data of companies that had of projects that had PWL, and then you're going to use that later on. So that data is already kind of biased, right?
So
in the
yeah.
sense of the proportion of people who are getting this, there's definitely a difference. So there is already a little bit of bias going into this, even in the model.
Yeah, there absolutely. And there's no way of getting around that bias, right? Because we are assuming that the Kickstarter staff does understand something about the market, right? And so they're identifying the signal of quality. The idea is that they are going to maybe apply it less consistently that we would hope, and that any variation that they have, if we apply a more consistent bar across all the projects, that we would just naturally see an increase in the amount of African Americans that receive this PWL designation. And that's in line with the Cowgill 2018 paper about resume screening.
And I'm just curious, have you tried this with training the model on something else, on things like success of being able to collect enough money or some other outcome instead of PWLs? Because I know earlier when you were answering sort of Hannah and Kiara's question, you said that they weren't necessarily trying to pick projects that are more likely to succeed, but it seems like the projects that they do pick succeed. And it's I haven't seen an experimental data to say exactly which way causality goes there. So I'm wondering if you use the different outcome in terms of just directly predicting, will this or will this not succeed? I wonder if that's going to have any impact. Yeah.
So we can look at that. We do train a model on success and looking at the outcome of success. And when we do that, one, we're not exactly optimizing for the same thing as projects we love, because projects we love is partially about creativity, whereas there's all these other factors that can go into success or the number of backers. And we're still going to find evidence of bias because we know that there is bias on crowdfunding platforms. So this idea that if we can somehow come up with a way of increasing or changing this quality measure, that's going to be impactful. But certainly as a robustness check, we can try. One of the challenges is just we want to think about the content of the project itself, and there is really no good way of thinking about quality aside from outcomes. This badge.
Yeah, Sam has put a question in the chat.
Sorry, it was more like a comment, but
okay.
Yeah, but I think that's a great idea. So we can look at it, especially if we were ever able to get this into some type of an experiment, a field experiment, comparing projects that were just on the margin. But we could certainly also look at that within our PWL model to see what happens right at the margin of people that we would designate versus don't designate. Yep. Thank you.
That strikes me as almost another paper. It's a great idea, actually.
Do you have access, Lauren, do you have access to the employees who made these choices of PWL? Because I wonder whether they can tell you whether they were considering features or characteristics of the project that you're not capturing with your many variables. Because the big uncertainty here is the big unobservables, right? What are we missing? And I know you have a ton of features, but maybe employees are able to see something that you cannot capture with these metrics. And I wonder whether they can tell you.
Yeah, so I'm supposed to meet with them soonish. I don't know if they'll have the answer to these particular questions, but yeah, it would be interesting to see if what they say, because what they tell project creators is actually very much so in line with the features that we have, with the exception of the intangible, it's exciting, or it is innovative. It's very difficult to capture those with features, absolutely. And so that's why I think it would be great to eventually do something like an experiment to say, well, maybe there's something that they're figuring out that we can see in our data, and then we could train the model to hopefully kind of or come up with features and train a model to try to identify those. Yep.
Or even, present them with two projects that from your propensity score come up with exactly the same propensity score. One is by an African-American, one is by somebody else. Mm-hmm. Okay. And tell them, which one would you choose and why? Tell me why.
Okay. Interesting. Yeah. We can think about that as a way to better understand what our model is or is potentially is not capturing. Thank you. Okay, so just again to the methodology overview, we're going to train the models, we're going to come up with a threshold for recommendation, and then we're going to estimate these effects of the PWL recommendation. So we've divided our data set into 3 data sets, a holdout data set of the last 6 months worth of data, and then the remainder is broken up into 80% training, 20% test. We're using a baseline model that's trained with the training data only. And we want to pick an explainable model. And I'll talk about that more later. Then we implement our fairness constraints, and then we select 2 models. So this is, again, an overview of the model training. So first we compare two different logistic regressions and decision trees. We have our PWL as the target, and we vary the level of complexity in the hyperparameters. We want these explainable models so we can understand exactly what's going into it, to do a bit of a sanity check to see, does that match what Kickstarter says are the criteria for projects we love, and we do find that, right? So we use L1 logistic regression because it had the highest AUC. Coefficients mirror the Kickstarter guidelines, and this does lead to a shrinking of the coefficients, and so that's valuable for us since we have about 300 features in our model. So it looks something like this. Just we have our background variables, our text variables, our image variables, and I'm going to stop there before I get into fairness. Are there any questions on just that basic part of it? Okay. So the fairness constraints are in the Fair Learn package. It uses this baseline model that we just identified as a black box and performs this grid search over the parameters for cost-sensitive classifiers. So it's going to train alternative classifiers by reweighting, and it's going to minimize the weighted sum of the error rate between the error rate and the fairness measure. So in our case, we're using demographic parity as the fairness measure. And it's going to be parity between A = 1 and A = 0. And so we have these 20 different relabelings, and we're going to use that, train different models with those relabelings to see if we can find a fairer model or a more accurate model. So this is the result of that. On the x-axis, there's the AUC for each of these models, and on the y-axis is the demographic parity. So again, this is just looking for different values in the cost in the classifier. And we find that there's one model that has a significantly better demographic parity. That's model 17, and that's denoted as MDP for demographic parity. And we also notice, this is our baseline model, has the star on it. We find a model that is just slightly better with the AUC. And so we choose that as our accuracy model. Okay, and that's model 6. So we use that as model AUC. Okay.
And demographic parity is the percentage point difference in the share of PWL?
Yes, exactly.
Okay.
And the probability between them. Okay.
So like a 4% means that, what is it? 62% of the PWLs are assigned to non-African American and 58 to African American.
It's that percentage difference. Yeah.
Got it. Thanks.
And just to give you a sense of what these scores look like, this is on the holdout data set. In many ways, they're very similar. And most of the projects have below a 0.2. So it's very, very low, which is good because most projects should not become projects we love. Projects we love should be the top 10%. And I'm going to get more into the scores in just a minute. But that's the overview of training the model. Are there any questions, any other questions? Okay. So now we have to think about moving from these propensity scores into an actual recommendation designation. As I said, the goal is to convert this into a binary PWL. And so at what propensity score should we set the recommendation threshold? In the fairness literature, there's post-processing to minimize disparities, but that's going to lead to its own challenges. So if we look at these two models, we have on the x-axis is the decision threshold. So if we set the decision threshold at, let's say, 0, the percentage of projects that would be above the threshold are 100% because all projects are 0 or greater. And as we move that decision threshold over towards 1, you can see that the percentage of projects that are above the threshold continue to decrease until they're 0. Now, the dotted line represents A = 1, and the solid line represents A = 0. And for the accuracy model, MAUC, we see there's a gap. So as we change the threshold, let's say if the threshold is at 0.25%, the percentage of projects above the threshold are lower for A = 1. However, that's not the case for the disparity model. As we can see, they're fairly similar for the entire curve. If we were just looking at ways to minimize that in post-processing, we might end up at 0. And that's not good for the platform, right? We want to make sure that some projects get this designation, that they are truly highlighting projects. So that's why we're not using fairness as our post-processing metric. The default, of course, would be just to set the threshold at 0.5. And so if you look at that, that means we're going to get about 5% of projects. And that seems just too low, but we're going to use that as one counterfactual. And the other one is the top 10% of this of these curves. So we're going to use the projects that are in the top 10% of the propensity score, and that's going to give us roughly the same level of exclusivity that we have now. Okay. And so just to summarize that, if we compare the two threshold choices, we end up with a 2x2 model. So there's 4 different recommendation schemes based off of the model and where we have the threshold itself. And so what this gives us, we have the actual PWL badges. This is on the holdout data set. And this is the overlap. So we have about 400 projects that were actually designated as PWLs that were also designated as PWLs using our demographic parity with a threshold of 0.5. Okay. So it's a smaller overlap than we were expecting, and I find this to be interesting. For the demographic parity and the accuracy, we find a much larger overlap. So if we look at demographic parity and this AUC, we find about 75% of projects were identified by both the accuracy-based model and the fairness-based model. And that continues. This top 10%, we have about 2,000 projects that are identified. And we find there's more overlap, about 1,900 projects overlap.
But the question is, for the T equals 0.5, is it because I just have fewer projects that I assign credits to? And so necessarily that will be lower than 2,800. So the question is, of the projects that I assign as PWL within the T.5, how many of those, so what's the share of those that the actual PWL had chosen?
I'm sorry. So this goes in both directions. This is just,
so I would like a confusion matrix. For each of these options, I would like a confusion matrix to see how many are false positives and false negatives.
And that's fair. I didn't show the full confusion matrix for each of them just because it seemed like a lot, but I think that would make sense to include in there because this is just the positive overlaps.
Okay.
So I see in the chat, could you explore by drawing a scatter plot between a whole range of threshold and parity measure to see if there's an interesting pattern or correlation between the two? We have not done that, but we certainly can. I think that would be interesting. So just to give you a sense of what we recommend. So one example is this dirt hugger, building community scale composting facilities. And this project did ultimately end up being successful with about $66,000 in donations and 200 backers, but it was not a project we love. And same thing with this one. This is Ronan, the Mushari Kingdom. And again, this was not a project we love, but it did end up being successful. Here are 2 examples of projects that were projects we love that our model did not identify. One is the Foam Brain Gear Sentinels of the Multiverse. It is in fact cut off at the bottom with this collection. And so when you look at what Kickstarter's guidance to project creators said, it said no text or logos. And so it's interesting that there's a lot of text and logos in here. And same thing with this Lulu Lemonade Fall Friends Giving. This project did end up being successful. but it's about lemonade and there's some slang and things in there. So looking at this, I felt more comfortable that there is something that is happening as far as the quality that we're picking up. Yep. And the variation in what the Kickstarter staff is identifying as a project we love. Okay. So any questions so far as to the choices for the recommendation threshold? Whoops. Okay. So the last is estimating the effects of PWL recommendations on project success. So here's where we train two models. We train it on a binary on success. So did they hit the fundraising goal, yes or no, and the number of backers. And then we used our recommendation PWL backers to estimate the overall effects. So we used the same training and test data sets. We estimated a random forest model and then a generalized boosted regression for the backers. And essentially what we did is we had these success models and we used the actual products we love badge and then all of our other features, and we trained on the model to estimate success. And then we ran 4 different essentially simulations. So instead of using the actual PWL, we used our recommendation PWL with all the other features and estimated success. Okay. So here's what we find as far as the overall success. We find that using this threshold measure right here, so we have significantly fewer projects. We have about 1,000 projects that are PWL. We get a lower success rate overall on the platform. So this is looking at all projects, PWL, not PWL. What's the expected success rate? And then when we have our top 10%, we have a higher success rate. And this is the significance compared to the baseline. For backers, it's a different story. We have lower backers across the board. This is expected for our threshold is 0.5, but it's less expected for our top 10%. And so that's one of the reasons why we're trying to understand what are some of the drivers. The expected success rate is higher. Again, it's lower across all models, but part of it is that there are different drivers. There are different drivers for the two. And I saw there's a question in the chat, but it's.
No, it's like goodbye.
Oh, it just started flashing orange and I thought, oh, I don't want to miss a question.
So I have a question because there were some doubts about the causality of PWL causing success. And so I wonder whether, and because you can't get around that because you don't have an experiment, what you have is what you have. I wonder whether you can run some sensitivity analysis. So let's say that your coefficient, your lift is estimated to be 10%. But let's assume that part of that 10% is endogenous. And so maybe the actual causal effect of the PWL is 5%, is a share of that coefficient. Mm-hmm. Like, I wonder whether that would change. Because ultimately what you're running is a counterfactual with some causal relationships that are a bit uncertain, right? And so I wonder if some sensitivity analysis may help here in the absence of an experiment.
Okay. Yeah, we will definitely think about more ways to run that sensitivity. Yeah. I like the idea of trying to find projects that are on the margin to see how it changes, but we really can't focus on, I mean, to your point, the causal element of PWL. We know that it's there from other experiments, but there's, to your point, there's a lot that's happening with the projects we love and with success. Yep. As far as our model, breaking it down into PWL and non-PWL, sensitive attribute, not sensitive attribute, we find that the success rates are lower overall for this PWL, for non-PWL projects, and that they are higher for PWL. So this was interesting to me, and I think that part of it is that the last point that I forgot to make on this page is the different drivers of success. So for success, for our model for success, the biggest driver is the goal, which makes sense. It's binary. So the lower the goal, the more likely you are to achieve that goal. And we seem to then expect that lower goal projects are going to be more likely to hit their goal. Whereas for backers, what contributes most, or the most important feature in the backers model, is whether it's a project we love. It seems that there's something about that additional visibility. And so if you look here, our backers model, you see across the board, we would expect to see within each category higher backers for the most part, especially true for PWL, but we assign fewer PWL under our model. And so that's one of the reasons why at a site level, it seems as though it's really important to maintain the number. And our model assigns 700 less, even in the top 10%, we assign 700 less projects we love. In the holdout, there's actually 13% of projects have a PWL designation. And so it's much higher than the test set, the test and training sets.
So Lauren, so what's interesting there, so that prediction is coming off of, it's just a one-time prediction, right? You have your algorithm, you have all your features, you put it in the algorithm and you make a prediction. Whereas in practice, so here's what's bothered me. So in practice, when you look at the number of backers, it follows this, I mean, we were talking about this dynamic over time about whether you get early number of backers or not. And you tend to see these bandwagon models, you almost want to call it a bandwagon model of backing, that ones that get early backing get this extra nonlinear kick in terms of followers. And I wonder if there's a sense in which you're not capturing that because of the way your algorithm is just sort of this one shot, and it in some sense can't, or really cannot capture what PWL might actually be doing, which is giving this bandwagon, getting a bandwagon started.
I completely agree. The dynamics are missing, and part of the challenge with the dynamics is that it's a one-time designation, and it happens right at the start of the project. And so it would be really interesting to look at how that designation can change the accumulation, and something along the lines of just changing one thing about the project and seeing the differences that it would make for backers.
So if you thought that was important, this would not, in some sense, you can't capture that with this approach, right? That's a
no, because it's again this one-time thing. Now it would be interesting to look at maybe the accumulation of backers as a success measure of it, but we just don't have the data for that. We know the total backers yet.
So what it reminds me of, and maybe when you get to the end, I'll give you a little longer explanation. If you were to run an experiment here, right, it would be as if you were to give PWLs to those who would not have otherwise received it, right, to see what would happen, right? That's the only way you'd be able to get that bandwagon effect measured. It reminds me of these experiments that have been done in cable television ratings for, rent-a-movies, where they deliberately intervened and gave movies larger rank than they actually acquired from users, to see if it started bandwagons for movies that were of, actually had not. And it turns out they could for a short while. That was the interesting question.
Yeah, it's really fascinating how a lot of these preferences are so subject to ranking effects or to
and
short run dynamics.
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
So on a similar note, one thing is that it's a one-time designation, but you can check for the projects that you have. You can check how many backers and how big percentage of the goal the projects got, like within the first week that they were posted, with or without the badge. So you have those projects have their certain quality and appeal, and they may get faster on the badge within the first week if they have the badge, or they don't. And you should see it not by the final accumulation, but by the first week or whatever the small amount of time. And another thing is, it's not just the taste. So what I see here are the network effects, right? I want to back a project. I have a limited funds, and I want to back the project that is going to ultimately succeed. So I have, let's say, I like 7 projects, but I'm going to back only 2. I don't want to freeze my funds if the projects are not going to succeed. I'm going out of the 7. I'm going to choose the 2 that are most likely to succeed. So I want to go to the project that everybody else is going to go, a classic network effect. And what the batch is doing is increasing focality. Right? So it's not the taste kind of like I'm going because everybody else is going there for no particular reason, but I'm going there and there may be a rational reason for that.
Mm-hmm.
So,
yeah, so I completely agree that it's going to make it more salient, and it's going to help give people a reason to focus their constrained resources, because they can't back every single project on the site. And so from that perspective, I think it would be interesting to see what happens if you have a different way of choosing the projects. Do you still see those same dynamics? And while I imagine that you would, we can't be certain without actually implementing that field experiment. But this certainly gives the suggestion that it would not. And so there are other ways that we can look at it as well, not just the binary success, but as you mentioned, the percentage of the goal raised. And also we were going to look at revenue as well. Yep. Okay. So that's it for the findings. Our key findings are, as we said before, and some of the contributions of the literature are examining this practical strategy to mitigate bias. So one paper said, it would be great if you more equitably distribute the PWL badges, but the challenge is, okay, how do we more equitably distribute it? And this gives us a method to do that. And we also connect this fairness AI to bias mitigation techniques. So previously, I haven't really seen the use of fairness-aware AI as a method to try to reduce the disparities in digital platforms. And we also have analyzed the trade-offs between fairness and economic objectives, right? Something that I didn't highlight before, but that's true, is it's only a small number of projects that are needed to achieve parity. So if we look at the differences between, I think there's only 49 projects in the holdout sample that were both African American and Project We Love. We ended up having about 70 projects. And so that's a huge jump right there of about 6% to 9%, and parity is 11%. So it's really only a small amount of projects that we need because there's so few people on the site, which is a different challenge. So we also, for managerial implications, we explore automation. When we find modern AI yields some, fair AI yields the most. And there's this potential for AI human hybrid decisions or a recommendation engine for products we love. So maybe you don't want it to be automatically distributed, but even re-ranking it might produce some improvement. And so this is, I think, an interesting avenue to explore more for future work, right? What if we do rank it? Does that change what people choose? Also, does that change what the backers will focus? Do we see the best decisions made together, both from a fairness and an economics perspective? So I think there's a lot of opportunity to explore in that nexus. Limitations are that disparities do persist. So even with this automated technology, we're still not getting to 10% are designated projects we love. And so there's this continued need for more research into the causes and solutions for these disparities, right? There might be a reputational risk for equity. So if you just say that we're going to use a fairness-aware AI, there might be some pushback from users. And then again, there's this opportunity for field experiments to test these automated PWL recommendations because there's a natural limitation to using the simulation, right? But our overall conclusion is that fairness-aware models are a practical strategy to reduce disparities without sacrificing economic objectives to the degree that people would be worried about. And so that's the end of my talk. So thank you very much. Any questions?
That's great. We certainly have time to have a conversation. Great.
Hi, Lauren. This is Tianshu. I really enjoy your talk, and thanks a lot for the study. Very interesting. I really love it. And I just have two quick questions related to like some of the question like Shane and Hannah and Kiara had. So the first question is, it seems in your setting, the like in a lot of previous setting, like hiring, resume screening, there seems to be a fixed quota or resource to be allocated. But in your case, this PWL certificate seems to be more flexible. I just want to learn your thought on whether the abundance or scarcity of your PWL allocation will like affect the signaling value itself, and if not, then like whether the platform have just enough resource to allocate across those. So I think that's something interesting about your setting because you don't have the fixed quota thing. And my second question is related to some of the earlier question by Kiara and Hannah. Like based on your current findings, do you think this PWL is kind of increasing, like growing the pie of the entire market and make the funding allocation more efficient, or it is more of a redistribution of a fixed pie? Like, that's so. Yeah, and I think those two questions are very, because I think that's something unique in your setting, and that's an opportunity for you to make a contribution. Yeah.
Thank you, and that's an excellent point. So I don't have any analysis about the scarcity of PWLs, but my intuition from the literature and just from looking at things that you would have to keep it somewhat scarce in order for it to maintain its signaling value. But to your point, is it 10%? Is it 15%? You have some flexibility there, and that's something that we can definitely investigate more and think more about as a contribution. I have the sense that it's redistributing, but again, hasn't been much that looked at whether this is a method to increase, because there's different ways of increasing the pie, right? Perhaps you have backers who come and who are more likely to convert. And so that's one way, is by increasing the number of people. Or there could be someone who says, gosh, I am so moved by this project we love that I only intended to give $50, but I'm going to give $100. So you can also have an increase in revenue as well. I know that I actually worked at Donors Choose many, many years ago. And that was something that they noticed, that you have projects that are very close to the finish line. They're more likely to go over the finish line if you tell people that that's where they are. And so that's one way that you can grow the pie. Projects We Love, I don't think has that same urgency to it as far as fundraising opportunities, which is why I think that it would be more redistributing interest. But again, I'm not sure, and I haven't seen much that's looked deeply into that particular signal. So those are both great points. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Laura. I think for your second question, like if the discrimination like is taste discrimination, then I think that the allocation of PWL may kind of mitigate that kind of information asymmetry and allow the backer to invest the funding to some of those projects that should have been otherwise invested. Then that should be able to that should kind of help grow the pie. Like the same case for like a lot of other information asymmetry contexts like Airbnb and others. But if it's more like a statistical discrimination, then I think probably it's more of a distribution per se. But I think it's definitely something super cool, super interesting. And thank you again for the great talk.
Thank you.
And another thing about growing the pie or redistribution, maybe a question of
what happened?
Yeah. We lost her.
She's gone.
Okay.
Oh. Well, she'll come back, I bet.
Yeah. So any other questions or comments? I do think that the last comment is an interesting point about the various causes that could lead to these disparities. So there's statistical discrimination as far as believing that certain fundraisers are lower quality, and that's why we see the reputational aspects make a difference. Then there's taste-based, which is just if there is a signal, a project we love, then maybe people are more likely to ignore. And then there's the interest-based ones, that certain projects may be viewed as more niche and certain projects might be viewed as having a wider audience. And so that's another element as well. And I think one of the challenges with trying to tackle these questions of disparities are just there's so many different potential causes. And so how do you address them in these various different ways?
Oh, I did have a sort of a kind of a what about question. Have you tried, I mean, I understand why you focus the way you did here. I'm wondering what about other characteristics that don't receive PWLs as frequently? I don't know what they are, but one could imagine it would be pretty easy to just, sort through your data and find out what they are. And I'm just wondering if the algorithm ends up having the same effect, no matter what. Say you want to, it's age. Let's do age. I'll pick that one as sort of the easiest one. Older people and younger people in the pictures. And let's say your algorithm finds that PWLs for older people are 5% and 10% for everybody else on average. Would your algorithm still come up with a similar kind of result? That's, I'm wondering. In some sense, it's a question about the robustness of the way you're doing things. My suspicion is it would continue to give you kinds of results like this, but I don't know. And it's especially because of the funder, the one about funders. You wonder if that would persist if you were looking at some other demographic or not.
Yeah, and so I agree. I think that's interesting, and that's actually something that we're going to look at, not with age, but with a different racial group. So maybe we'd look at a completely different element. In a previous paper, we've looked at it across a couple of other attributes, and this is the one that stands out. So we don't necessarily see it in others, but I do think it'd be interesting for age, because we have that data as well.
And since we are at the other characteristics, I think rural versus urban is an interesting one.
In the US.
In the US, yeah. And I'm assuming like all of these projects are US based. Yeah. So I'm not even sure whether you have enough rural projects, but if you had, it'd be interesting.
So I agree. We don't have enough projects, unfortunately, but I think there's that rural versus urban divide is large. And you see it as far as what platforms people use.
Do you see regional things though? I mean, Kiara's question is really a good one. There's urban, rural. There's also regional differences in the U.S. in propensity to participate in these platforms. And I'm remembering back to one of the original crowdfunding papers that they found local support for musicians. Remember, made a huge difference. And so you would think, from that intuition in your context, that projects that are, taking place in bigger cities potentially just have a better chance, merely from the fact that New York has more people in it. Sort of that sort of thing. It would be interesting, actually, if true. To Kiara's point, you don't have to do just urban rural. You could do any regional.
Yeah, so we haven't looked at the PWL, like the region as the sensitive attribute, but we control for region because we do have, we have the location type and stuff. But yeah, I would be interested. I suspect that the sensitive attribute in this case would be the South. I think there's a negative perception of the South in this country. I just moved from North Carolina, so that's part of the reason why.
Very funny. I was going to go a different way. Okay. As a former Californian, I get to say this without trying to offend anyone. My old friends, everyone I grew up with, are the most parochial people ever, and so I would expect a California bias against anything outside of California.
I would expect that too.
Yeah.
But Shane, even with that, it can go both ways, because on one hand, you have more people to back projects coming from California and New York, but there is many more projects than an off project in...
absolutely correct, Hannah. Although I also expected New York bias as well. New Yorkers, as a rule.
That's true.
Oh, yeah, but I think it's like there's a supply and demand, and there is a tension even with that.
I recognize what you're saying. Yes, you're absolutely right.
But what's interesting about the California bias, though, is that Kickstarter, we're looking at Kickstarter, right? And so if we think about that Silicon Valley idea of entrepreneurial and creative ventures, we might see that there's a different rates of designation.
Yeah, I grew up with all these people who have never been east of the Sierra Mountains. And and I go home and I talk to them and they look at me and there is just a parochialism there.
Well, you're a foreigner now.
I'm an outcast at this point. Anyway, sorry. Hannah, you
I'm back. Yeah. After this dramatic, my computer decided to die right that moment. So it was the previous comment about growing the pie and or redistribution or growing the pie. So it depends how the pie is defined. If we define that the pie is the number of projects that are backed and they go to the next stage and they are developed, then sometimes with the same number of funds, by preventing some of the projects to get too many, because projects may get far more than funded. But then if we redistribute this money to projects that are just below the line, we are going to get many more projects funded with the same amount of dollars. And if this is the case, if this is what the badge does, then it actually may be growing the pie without additional funds. And so this is one point. And second, in terms of how scarce does the badge need to be, it reminds me of number of papers about dating and signaling in dating. So there was this paper about Korean dating sites where you would have roses that you could give, and everybody would have only 2 roses that they could give. But then for Valentine's Day one time, the website decided to give a number of people 8 roses instead of 2, and it created inflation in the signaling value. So this and here it's the same thing, because you kind of want to increase the matching of the match quality, so to say. And there's also this signaling value, and you want to have, if it does serve this role of focality, it has to be scarce, and maybe this literature on signaling in matching markets may give you a way to kind of estimating what would be the optimal number of those badges.
Yeah, thanks, Hannah. I totally agree. I think the scarcity might matter to some extent. So and the value of the signal is based on the observational data in the past context. So like it's probably safe to assume, like with the similar level of scarcity, the effect may persist. I think that's probably safe to assume. So like I think the paper is probably, the new prediction model is probably keeping the similar level of scarcity. So probably the some of the previous effect can be naturally extended.
Yeah, but
there does seem to be a trade-off though because if you fund or support more projects, they're all going to succeed. Maybe they're serving different markets. So like by your logic, it would be like PWL only goes to the very top, but I'm not sure that achieves the parity outcome as you would want, right? Because it seems to me the smaller the set, like the smaller the accredited set is, the more likely there's any small noise could be amplified into a larger effect. Sorry if I'm not making sense, just an intuition.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that smaller effect could be amplified. And I think there's a lot of interesting dynamics as far as how behavior is changing. And I also think this idea that if you cap at the goal that you might end up, also, that's another way of redistributing of funds, because there might be this oversubscription to particular projects, and that's not in the overall social welfare of the platform, right? To get as many people as possible to have their projects funded. And so I really think it'd be interesting to look more deeply into some of these questions, and I'm just not sure.
Lauren, one way, do you know from prior work if there have been estimates of the degree of substitution across projects of different types in their ability to raise funds? Because one way to address these questions, not entirely, see, there are two mechanisms at work, at least in the kind of question that's being asked here. One is, do one projects cannibalize the other, right? Then they substitute for the same resource pool. Then the other thing going on, as Sam was bringing up, is they're differentiated projects, and so they draw from essentially different pools. All right, so you could partially address that debate with evidence about the degree to which projects substituted for each other across different characteristics. Right, partially. I'm not sure it's going to be fully informative, but that's the open question. And I wonder if previous research has at least gotten into that a little bit, and so you'd be able to inform whether the kinds of projects that you see African Americans do, for example, are in the more substitutable category or in the more differentiated category. And you kind of alluded to this at the beginning a little bit, and I think that's one way to address this question.
Yeah, so there's been look at substitutions, of course, but not particularly with that intersection. And so I think that would be an interesting direction to try to understand the differences of the natures of the projects. Yeah.
Well, we hit 1:30. You had a great audience. Boy, everybody was really interactive today, so it was great.
Yeah, it was wonderful. It was a lot of great discussion and great feedback. So thank you so much.
Yeah, really, it was awesome. It was very interesting. There were a bunch of things I'd never seen before.